Let's look at a scenario where an HTTP module might be useful. Modules are a bit harder to understand than handlers, so to really demonstrate how they work, I think it's important to build something beyond just a hello world sample. So often when you're working with a website, you'll need to start implementing redirects. Perhaps your marketing team wants a URL changed, or maybe you're just experimenting with SEO. Regardless of the reason, there are a lot of ways to handle redirects in MVC. The most common way this is done is by using some of the redirect action results, such as redirect to action. However, these can be expensive redirects because both requests have to travel all the way through the MVC pipeline, and this includes building and executing controllers and so on. Well, with an HTTP module, we can skip the MVC framework entirely. Not only will this illustrate how modules can take control of a request, but it will also reinforce some of the concepts we discussed in the previous module. Inside Visual Studio, I've added some code to our project. Over in our web config, I added a section called redirects, which includes a couple of nodes. Each of these nodes represents a redirect, which we can assign a name to, and then declare the old URL that we want to match against, and the new URL that we want it to redirect to. There are various ways of implementing redirects in ASP.NET using the web config or through code, but in this approach we're actually going to use both. That way we can easily make new entries by updating the web config, but still manipulate and work with those entries easily in our code. And this will allow us to logically handle different scenarios. I also added a folder to our project called configuration. Inside of here, I've added 3 classes that work with managing the web config entries that we just looked at. The code in these files just uses standard ASP.NET configuration classes. If you aren't familiar with these classes, don't worry, you should still be able to follow along and understand the concepts that are related to the lifecycle. I'll just run through these quickly so we can spend most of our time on the HTTP module itself. The first class is called redirect, and it's pretty straightforward. We have a C# property for each attribute on our redirect add elements that we put in our web config file. The configuration property attributes map the attribute names from our web config onto our C# class properties. We also have to create a class that represents a collection of our redirect items. We override 2 methods from the base class of configuration element collection. Create new element is called whenever we need a new instance of our add element, in this case a redirect, so we return a new redirect object. The second method just tells our collection what property to use when accessing the elements in the collection. The last class we need to create is called redirect section. This represents the overall redirects configuration section that we added to our web config. Here we only need one property, which we'll call redirects, and that returns a redirect collection object. There's one other piece to note back in our web config. At the top of our configurations node, just make sure that you have a config sections child and add a new entry inside of it that maps our redirect section class to that web config section. Make sure you get the strongly typed name correct, and it'll be different depending on your project name and your namespaces and all that. So now let's go ahead and add the actual HTTP module to our project. We can do this by right-clicking on our configuration folder and just choosing to add a new class. So we'll call that redirect module and go ahead and create that. And next we want to make sure our class implements the HTTP module interface. So let's take care of that first. And we can then use the Control-P shortcut to have Visual Studio implement that for us. Now our module isn't going to use any resources that need to be manually disposed of, so we can just leave that method blank for now. And at the top, let's declare a private variable of the type HTTP application, and we can call that variable context. ASP.NET will actually pass in an instance of this class to our init method down below. So inside that method, we can go ahead and just assign that parameter to the field we created. Next, we want to assign an event handler to the map request handler event. We're choosing this event because we want to execute our module's code before the MVC framework itself executes. The redirect method is the code that makes everything work, so I'll go ahead and add that in here. First, we just get a reference to all our redirect entries in the web config. We then loop through them and compare the incoming URL to what was entered in the web config. If it matches any of the old URLs that we want to redirect from, we call the response.redirect method and pass in that new URL for our entry. If we want to add more URLs, we simply add them to the web config. One last thing we have to do is register our module. I'll do that in the web config for the sake of variety. So I'll add an entry inside of the modules node of system.webserver, and just make sure you get that full name of your module correct for the type attribute. The name can be whatever you'd like to call it. So now let's add a few breakpoints into our code. We want to add one inside of our module's event handler code to make sure that that's running. Next, let's put 2 breakpoints in our controller, one in the action method that would normally handle the URL we're redirecting from, and one to our new destination method. And once those are in place, we can go ahead and run our application. From the home page, let's click on the link to our About page. Now you can see that we hit the code inside our HTTP module first, and that the URL we entered matches one in our web config entries. If we hit continue, you can see we jump over to our controller, but not to the original action method that we requested. Instead, we land inside of this new destination method, which in this case is contact. So there's 2 important concepts to remember here. The first is that we took full control of the request using an HTTP module, and we redirected it to another URL. The second is that our module handled an event before the MVC handler actually executes, meaning that on the first request, the framework never even processed the request. No controller or action methods were involved until the second request. The new request did not match any of our redirects, and so it bypassed our module and just carried on to the MVC handler execution. Hopefully this gives you an idea of the power of HTTP modules and maybe some ideas of how you could use them in your own projects.